Good evening. I'm Leah Rauch, Director of Education at Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, our Board of Directors, volunteers, and staff, I would like to thank you for being here tonight. Today marks the 80th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi forces. On the heels of the German army's invasions, Einsatzgruppen, or mobile killing squads, murdered over 1.5 million people, primarily through mass shootings. Their main targets were Jews, regardless of age or gender, and also Roma, people with intellectual and physical disabilities, and Soviet state officials. These systematic mass killings marked the beginning of what the Nazis called the final solution, the deliberate and planned mass murder of European and Soviet Jews. To mark the anniversary of this event, we've invited Dr. Wendy Lower to discuss her new book, The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed. Dr. Lower is the John K. Roth Professor of History and Director of the McGrublian Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College. She's the author of multiple books, including the National Book Award and National Jewish Book Award finalist, Hitler's Furies, German Women and the Nazi Killing Fields, which has been translated into 23 languages. Her most recent book, The Ravine, released earlier this year, addresses mass shootings following the invasion of the Soviet Union through the examination of a photograph taken during a massacre at a ravine near Mariupol, Ukraine. Welcome, Dr. Lower.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Before we begin, I want to give a special thanks to our community partners listed at the start of the program. And if at any time you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A and we will try to address as many questions as possible later in the program. So tonight's program addresses one photograph showing the murder of one Jewish family in occupied Ukraine. But tonight we are honoring all of those killed in the former Soviet Union. So I'd like to begin with a moment of silence to honor the lives that were lost while showing the photograph that is the subject of The Ravine. It's a hard photograph to look at, but I encourage you not to look away, but instead to look closer. So now we'll have a moment of silence. This is an incredibly difficult photo to look at. And I've been recommending your book, Wendy, to so many people. And I always tell them it's so well written and well researched, but it's also incredibly difficult to read due to the subject matter. And I found myself having to put the book down and just physically distance myself from it. So my first question is, when we are confronted with this photograph, when our instinct is to look away, why is it important for us to do the opposite and to look closer?
Well, I think that as we start to analyze the photograph and delve into what's happening, we start to realize that there's a lot of history to be discovered, including lives lost, including identifying perpetrators of genocide who went, kind of undetected and lived out their lives after the war. So there's justice, a kind of historical justice that can be achieved when you look at a photograph like this. And in the beginning of the book, I even address other mass atrocities kind of briefly as far as the ethical kind of imperative to respond to a photograph like this, and to not to kind of promote ignorance of these events. And as painful and difficult as it is, and I think not everyone can do this work. I'm not a direct descendant of any of the individuals pictured here, or even those, kind of involved in the Holocaust. I have the kind of the benefit and the privilege to do this work from a distance. I don't know if I could do this work if I had a kind of direct connection, especially to the Jewish community, in this case in Meropil. So I want to, acknowledge that reality. But I think that genocide, historically, what the genociders seek to achieve, or other perpetrators of massive human rights violations, and the institutions that support them and continue to carry out these kinds of crimes and injustices, um, that they seek to suppress these very images and to suppress this history and to erase it from history books and from memory, and even, go into archives and expunge archival records. And I think it's really incumbent upon us to resist that. I mean, it's an act of research, can be an act of resistance, can be an act of memorialization and education. And often, as educators as well, one is trying to find the ways to engage our students. And I think that these photographs can be used in the classroom, but with absolute care, and only when we encourage this kind of inquiry and deep thinking and critical thinking about what's happening, to kind of be passive observers of this kind of history, this kind of act that's being portrayed, is to me not not the ethical way, not the humane way to respond to this. But there are varying opinions of this, and there's been a pretty significant debate among scholars and cultural critics. And as you mentioned, the notion of looking away. And some of the witnesses I showed this photograph to looked away. It's a shameful part of our past, but it's our past. And I think acknowledging that as a starting point, and then the next step for me, and I hope for some of the folks in the audience, educators and students, the next step is the research. As survivors are passing, it's harder to, they've done so much of this work for us. They have told these stories, articulated these events in words, on videotape, in classrooms for us, and tried to describe these events where there were no pictures left, where there were no sources left to bear witness, as we call it. And that we have to continue that work in different ways on the behalf of the survivors as well. And that means doing this difficult research on photographs like this. This photograph, as you start to study it more closely, you realize how much is there. It is here, for instance, if you start with the shoes and not the horrific violence that is at the center of the photograph, the murder of a family, a Jewish family, it raises all kinds of questions about the, what we would say, the kind of presence of absence, or the silences, the ambiguities, the gaps in our knowledge, the mysteries. Who was this person? This presumably a man, another victim, and all that remains right here in the foreground are his shoes. And of course, at the end of the book, I return to the shoes in a kind of meditation about memorialization, and why we have shoes behind glass at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and why we have shoes, bronzed along the Danube in Budapest, and why did someone like Adam Sutzkever, the poet, write in 1943 a poem, dedicated to his community, including his mother, who's, when these shoes came back from the deportations and he was sorting through them, that these kind of, it's a trope, but it's also a reality of the loss, of the enormous loss. And in the book, I, kind of pick apart the photograph like this in chapters, and as different facets of the Holocaust by bullets, as you described it at the start of our program. This is in broad daylight. We see the light here shining through this blotchy kind of draping look of, of of trees. It's mid-morning and the sun is passing through and entering the aperture of the camera. You know, this is a photograph. We are right now kind of taking the view of the photographer close up. The photographer didn't have a zoom lens, so he's standing close to the action. So it's an open massacre, not behind the walls of the gassing centers that most people are familiar with, like Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is happening at the edge of someone's hometown. The sounds, the sights, the smells, the screams, everything is happening, you know, in conjunction with this photograph, and it is experienced by a kind of community at once. What does that mean for that community and for that place and for the environment and the topography of that place? Because mass murder, as it appears in this image from Ukraine, was taken in 1941. I should tell you, October 13th, 1941, and I can tell you why I know that in a minute. But it was taken in Mariupol, Ukraine, at the height of these mass shootings in the fall of 41, post-invasion of Soviet Union. The major decisions had been made at this point to pursue physical extermination of the Jews, that extreme of the final solution. The gassing centers now, the architects are starting to sketch out plans for one of the first gassing facilities in Belzec. This is already in October. But as these plans are unrolling for all of European Jewry, the first assault is being inflicted against these shtetls, these small communities in places like Ukraine. And the environment is the Germans who are testing out methods at this point, whether it's gassing vans and in here different types of mass shootings. They're using the landscape, the local terrain. They're using the rivers, they're using the swamps, they're using the ravines like Babi Yar. And this is how nature becomes part of this history, the environmental history, how the agency of nature is put to work, that the Germans suffocate the victims in these mass graves. That's how they, quote unquote, finish them off. They throw the children in the mass graves because they're not going to waste bullets. And so this is this particular stage of the Holocaust, but it leaves all these traces. So while I have this singular photograph of this family and no documentation from that day, no German orders in archives telling, explaining what happened, no after action report explaining what happened. There is the terrain, the topography that is a source that is also part of how we reconstruct the history. And here you can see the killers, right? So the image is showing us the killers in the act, in their uniforms. That's another source of information. What unit is perpetrating this? Are these killers still alive? Can there be actual justice? What about this man with the hat in the background, a kind of onlooker who's been requisitioned to do this work on the spot? And then next to the Germans who are shooting, we see, they are actually shooting. Here's the cloud of smoke. There's evidence here in this ballistic reality of mass shooting and how smoke forms here in this kind of a haloing effect above the head of the woman. And I know this sounds very clinical and kind of forensic and going through it like this and maybe even dispassionate, but that's not the case at all. That I think that when you read this book, the drive to figure out all of this is that passion for trying to understand and also to restore the lives and dignity to these victims as much as possible. This is not how they wanted to be photographed. This was not what they expected on that day, October 1941, to be murdered with their loved ones. It's a photograph of collaboration. The killers are shoulder to shoulder. They don't speak the same language. They just have this shared anti-Semitic hate, this opportunism, and they've come together at this particular moment for this particular event. They are not going to encounter each other again after this day, after they've carried out this massacre. The Ukrainians are standing there wearing these overcoats, which are repurposed Red Army coats, and they are part of the militia. They have armbands. The Germans, these insignia, actually, I took years for me to figure out what the unit was, and it was not a regular police unit. It was not the Einsatzgruppen. These guys were customs guards. They were supposed to be checking packages at the railway station and the post office, and had just been, actually they volunteered. This is an all volunteer killing squad. Again, they don't speak the same language, but they went through interpreters. There's a shared understanding of what needs to be done and how it's going to be carried out. And these are just some of the facets of the photograph that I started to pull out and study in more depth, chapter by chapter.
Yeah, and you do such an incredible job taking all of those elements and going into so much detail, describing your process, of your research, and all of the information you were able to obtain with really nothing to go from except this photograph.
And I want to encourage the individuals now who are participating on this call, on this webinar, to send in their questions and share what they see in the photograph. I've gotten some amazing emails since the book was published, and individuals have used different other forms of technology besides zooming in and zooming out to identify other features of the photograph. The bullet casings down here, amongst the litter here of mass murder, these papers and these bullet casings. And so I'm always curious to find out what other people see. I mean, after studying it, I first saw it in 2009, and it was about almost 2 years of really studying this. When I noticed, I started to question the posture of the woman and why is she kind of in this perpendicular pose, and realized that with the light coming through here, that there was another figure here, and a small kind of trace of another child kind of slipping from her lap. And that, is another argument for the sticking with this research and studying these images so carefully. They're so rare. Actually, we see again and again the same photographs of the Holocaust, and I'll just back up very quickly, that become iconic, and they're not necessarily representing the history in total, or they've been cropped in certain ways, or we have no information about them. We don't know the photographer, we don't know the victims, we don't know in many cases where the photos were taken. So it's also, I think, important to go back to what are some of our kind of standard illustrations and talk to our students about what are we actually looking at? When do you think this was taken? Who is this person? What's happening? Was this photograph, maybe this photograph was used in a courtroom after the war? What is the agency of the photograph in the history? Not just merely an illustration of what happened, but that these photographs in themselves are instrumental in bringing about change, in the fact that photographs are shared with resistance movements or used in the courtroom, or presented to survivors to trigger their memories, or survivors present them when they're giving their testimonies, and they've been carrying these photographs around with them and miraculously, hiding them during roll calls inside their mouth, their family photographs. So the photograph in and of itself is a powerful source and has its own history to tell, and you can work with students in that way and raise those. Yeah.
Going off of your prompt, asking people to look and observe the details in this photo, someone was commenting about the child and the woman, asking if they were holding each other's hands. Can you tell us a little bit more about who this family was and what you discovered about these people?
Yes, thank you for that question. Wow. So I first saw the photograph in 2009, and it was brought to my attention by two Prague Czech journalists who had come from Prague, and they had found it in a security service, kind of former KGB-like archive in Prague, because the photographer was Slovakian. So when we talk about this photograph as an image of collaboration, the fact that the photographer was a Slovakian security guard, also mobilized for Operation Barbarossa among all the Axis powers, that's why we have it. And he was a hobby photographer, and he was interrogated about this photograph after the war, but it just sat in the archives and did not kind of see the light of day until the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the images came to light in the 1990s, and then I saw it in 2009, there were other photographs in the series. The photographer, when he went to this crime scene that day, he heard the sounds. His commander said, "Go check it out." And he grabbed his Zeiss Icon, his little portable pocket camera, and took these photographs. This was his like central image, but he took them as a kind of visual testimony as to what happened. And so out of the 7 photographs that he could put, so the book is also about the camera, like how many pictures of that could he take with that model camera? I found out it was Zeiss Icon. Well, with the film he had, he could take about 8, and I found 5. So there are 4 other photographs related to this one. And to answer the question of your audience member, one of the photographs, and it's in the book, was really chilling as I studied, and again, with the advent of digital technology, could zoom in and out and change the shading and so forth. And first discovered the little girl, and then discovered in one of the photographs the photographer took from the looking down into the mass grave at the end of this massacre. And you can see in the tangle of bodies, these polka dots are popping out like they are here, right? You get these contrasts, like in the visor here, and the little boy and his little feet. And in the actual grave itself at the end, you can see the polka dot. You can trace the woman's arm, and you can see that actually they are in the pit together still, and she's still holding that little boy's hand, which is, so they fell in together. And that was, another discovery as far as proving that this was part of a sequence. And also just the story of the victims and of the family. One chapter on the family, because this image, it stood out to me so starkly, not only the collaboration history here, but the family at the center of this, the mother and the children, and that the genocidaires, especially the Nazis, they sought to annihilate the Jewish race, as I called it, root and branch, entirely kind of biologically. And Hitler said in the summer of 41, about this time, actually, it was early July 41, to his ally, Croatian ally, not one Jewish family, and he used the word family, should remain on the continent of Europe, because the family unit, the sons will avenge the murdered fathers, the siblings, like that the family unit was critical to the existence of the race, of the procreation of the race. So they were determined to focus on the destruction of the family, and made, in their cruelty and determination, made this experience of suffering and of ultimately of murder like this a family experience, which is everyone's ultimate nightmare, that you are murdered with your loved ones, or that you have to make choices, as far as choiceless choices, as some scholars call it, as far as leaving or staying. And so I do kind of foreground the family in my book, and why Lemkin and others have not studied this more closely, and what this means as far as the experience of the victims. So this is all I had to go with to try to find the family, was this image, and then the town itself, and the date of the massacre. And that brought me into the world of Jewish genealogy, and the incredible, Jewish Gen, this great website, is a kind of community website, and the institutions we have, the museum in Washington, Yad Vashem, the International Tracing Service, to try to figure out on that day, when about 300 Jews, up to 300 were massacred, were there any lists of names? What were the surnames of the community that was left? How could I actually identify the family? And I'll just jump up to, we can go back to some of these other images as questions arise. But typically this is what we have. This is a list that the Soviets, when they came back in to Mariupol and started their first investigation in January 44, immediately started to find out from survivors and community members, put a list together, about 250 names of Jewish families, and what they knew of birth dates. And here you can see family units by surname. So what I did was just, the child in the image, I couldn't figure out the birth date of the woman. It's hard to tell. Her face is obscured in the smoke, but the boy is walking. She's holding his hand, maybe born 1935. And so here you can see here's a child born 1935, working on those family units to try to reconstruct one that might be this family, going through all the pages of testimony at Yad Vashem to see if a survivor had come forward. Here's one coming forward on the town of Mirapol, and speaking on behalf of murdered relatives, and to see if there were any ways I could match these testimonies with the photograph. And remarkably, as I went through these testimonies A to Z, I got to this one family, the Vaselyuk family, and the description of the testimony was very close to the history that I had kind of reconstructed. And not only that, the testimony had attached to it another photograph, and less, it's like 1%, maybe 1% of the millions of pages of testimony. And mind you, about half the victims who died in the Holocaust in Ukraine have not been identified because they were killed kind of without a trace, just, without a photograph like the one we are looking at. But this one not only had a testimony from this town, but it had a photograph attached, which is extremely rare, of what was left of a family in Mirapol. And these faces and this woman, just, it just struck me that they could be that family in the photograph, especially, like this little boy. And maybe this was the other child on her lap, and this was the woman. And I pursued that. The person who deposited this testimony, Svetlana Budnitskaya, lived in Southfield, Michigan, and I immediately called her, and that's in the book, and I interviewed her. And she could not, because she was a child and was evacuated during the war and then came back and obtained this photograph. This is from 1941. The aunts, the children, they're no more able-bodied men. They'd either been killed in the first wave of massacres to kind of prevent resistance, or they had been evacuated with the Red Army. But this image just really, I couldn't say for certain, because of course you don't want to misidentify, but the similarities, the likenesses, the possibilities, it's really quite striking, and perhaps probable that that in fact this is the family.
There's quite a few questions regarding the photographer. Who was he? Why did he take this photo? Who did he take that photo for? Can you give us a little bit more information about the photographer?
Here is the photographer. His name is Lubomir Skrovina, and he's, as I mentioned, from Slovakia. He was born in 1916, so he was about 25 years old when he was mobilized and deployed as a security guard in Ukraine, kind of backup reinforcements as the Wehrmacht, the German army, advanced towards Moscow. And his story was probably one of the biggest surprises, because the proximity of and the stability of the photograph indicated to me that he was taking it openly and not clandestinely, and not as kind of a resistance fighter, but he was there in uniform. And of course, the victims saw him there in uniform. And the victims, if they even noticed this man taking this picture, were further humiliated by being photographed at their moment of death. So initially, I didn't have a very good impression or a positive impression of Skrovina. And then as I started to research his biography more and read his testimonies from Prague, and he had to testify on 3 different occasions about these photographs, which fell into the hands of the kind of Gestapo-like authority in Bratislava. The way that he answered the questions revealed to me that he was very smart and very careful about how he chose his words. He had an incredibly good memory for details, and that with the help of his family, whom I was able to track down, as well as the camera, obtain the letters that he wrote to his wife, and photographs from Mirapol. This was taken, here he is in the middle here in the center of this photograph. And this was taken in Mirapol a few weeks before the massacre photos that he took. And I found out that he took more pictures of the killings and the pogroms as they were advancing eastward. And he was taking these photographs not because he had any kind of, he was complicit or had some lurid fascination. On the contrary, the letters that he was writing back to his wife included, they were together engaged in this resistance. She was providing him secretly with film. He was sending back the negatives. She was secretly developing them and told not to share them with anyone unless they were in the resistance. After he took this photograph, he said this was enough. He couldn't take it anymore. His hair was turning gray. His mind was turning black. He needed to go home. He pretended he was sick. He went back for the Christmas leave and checked himself into an asylum, and his wife kind of played along and visited him. He was not redeployed to Russia or to Ukraine. He stayed in his hometown, which was Banska Bystrica, which was the center of resistance in Slovakia. He shared these photographs with Jews in Banska Bystrica and said, don't go when they call for deportations. This is your fate. This is what's happening. He warned them. He hid a Jewish family in his attic. One was an OBGYN who actually delivered his son, Lubomir Jr., into the world in 1943. He brought supplies to the forest. He was really, is quite unbelievable. And he was actually awarded medals of bravery after the war by the, and even recognized after he, before he died in 2005. And he donated his camera that I showed you to the History of the Museum of Jews in this camera in Slovakia, the Bratislava Museum of History of Jews. So that's how we were able to find it. And he wrote expressly to the museum director, please display this and my photographs in an exhibit on the Holocaust, which at that point didn't exist.
It's an incredible story. So you alluded to this earlier, how you discovered among the perpetrators in this photo were customs officials, which to my knowledge is not something that had really come to light prior to your research. And so there's also some questions coming in regarding those customs officials and the role they played. Did you do more research into these customs officials, these individuals? Can you talk a little bit more about their role in these killings?
Yeah, this was really eye-opening because typically when I first looked at the picture, I thought, okay, could be Einsatzgruppen, members of these mobile killing units, part of the Himmler's agencies, the so-called ZIPO-SD, Secret Service, Secret Police. They could be regular kind of order police, regular cops that, like Christopher Browning and other scholars have studied, and they were much more numerous. There were hundreds of thousands of these deployed as the kind of the foot soldiers of the final solution, carrying out these mass shootings as the Einsatzgruppen after this first wave, as it were, in the summer of 41. But in fact, some of my colleagues said, oh, it's Order Police Battalion 303, and that's the unit went through there. And so I spent years actually going through cases investigating that unit. One case that had about 80,000 pages of material that was housed in Regensburg, and that was one of the units, Order Police 303. They were the lead unit at Babi Yar, and they were in Mirapol, and they did come back and carry out shootings in Mirapol, but not the one on October 13th, 1941. So it took me a while to figure that out, and I was kind of at a loss because, again, there weren't German documents really specifying these units and on that day in that location. And my colleague pointed me to a file about a massacre in Mariupol, Russia. In the archival filing of it, they misplaced the town in Russia, which is common that archivists and generally people don't realize that Ukraine is Soviet Ukraine was a separate republic and subsumed Ukraine into Russia, and that's another story. So this file, and I'm showing you the cover of it, it was only about 80 pages, so it's just a thin file, but wow, it really was the key find in determining that, in fact, these killers were just these customs officials. In addition to that, I was able to corroborate, and I'll tell you about this file in a second, that they were customs officials and that this is the right unit and these are the right names of the killers who were identified, because our photographer, our clever photographer, during one of his interrogations, he referred to the German killers as finance guards. That was the literal translation. I thought, why? He's being so specific. You know, it's always when you read these testimonies, I talk about in the Ravine, different ways to corroborate, different ways to look for obfuscation and kind of outright denial or lying, or different tricks as far as how perpetrators try to obscure, and how to unpack that, how to figure out where the facts are and the veracity of these testimonies. And Skrovina, that detail, when you find details like that, you know, those are good things to start with, because why would somebody provide that kind of detail? So in fact, yeah, they were finance guards, they were customs officials. And here we have a former member of the unit, this small unit that was stationed in this small town. In 1969, this is a German police report, a Strafanzeige. It's a formula, you know, it's just a form, a classic form that a police official on duty would, you know, kind of load up into his typewriter and just type up when somebody comes in and says, I want to report a crime. So here, this former comrade in this unit goes on in January 1969, January 1st, in this small town, this police station near Hanover, West Germany, says, I want to report a crime that happened in Mariupol, Russia, okay, it was Ukraine, in 1941 during the Nazi period. And the victims are Jewish and Russian people, right? So it's just incredible to see this kind of standard procedure, operating procedure on something that's so unusual. And here he explains how he was stationed in this town and there were mass shootings, and these were the two individuals, Kuska and Voigt, who voluntarily participated in this. The SS came into town on a Sunday night. These guys were playing scat, this card game, in the local canteen. And the SS said, why are there still Jews in this town? They're supposed to be gone, and who's going to take care of this starting tomorrow? And these customs guards, who were notorious anti-Semites and kind of the really rough ones in that group, they stood up, jawohl, and volunteered, and then they carried out it as we see it in the photograph. And the testimony from their former comrades that was collected in 1969, this described in very vivid detail. The Ukrainians are singing the Todeslied, they're drinking, they're raping the women. And it's just a very important, although slim file, very important for this detail. And in fact, when you compare the photograph, of course, the Germans denied, they caught up with one of the killers in the photograph. And he said, you know, he just perjured himself. And he just said, no, we didn't do any of the shooting. The shooting was done by the Ukrainians. And actually, I wasn't there, but then he describes it. So he's contradicting himself. And so it was quite, you know, for me, in a way, it was, in a weird way, it was, there was something gratifying about having that photograph and that testimony when I suspected there was lying and obfuscation, to have that photograph and say, yeah, he's lying.
Happened to those perpetrators after the fact? Were they put on trial?
Well, the Germans were not. This was a kind of perfunctory pro forma investigation. They ultimately ended up suspecting that the man who denounced his former comrades, this gentleman, Kurt Hoffman, he's retired here. They thought he had was vindictive, and he had his own reasons for denouncing them that were personal. And then so he was not a trusted, witness. And so they didn't take his statement very seriously. They couldn't find the other killer he mentioned. One of them was in Bremen, the other one they could not track down. And they just didn't pursue it. It was just, they kind of went through the motions, and within a year they just shelved it. They didn't have this photograph. Remember this incriminating photograph is sitting in Prague. They didn't go the next step to kind of make inquiries with officials in the Soviet Union. They didn't make inquiries with in other cases. It was just really not very determined in trying to get to the bottom of who was guilty here. And this is contrast rather sharply with the Ukrainian pursuit of justice in this case, because actually the Ukrainians were identified. And let's see if I can find the photo from that. Here we go. So on the Soviet side, this is one of the last cases concerning crimes committed during the Second World War. And it started rather late. This one started in 1986. So the Soviets first came in, they drew up these lists of names of Jewish victims. They immediately rounded up any militia who were still there, and they had these quick kind of kangaroo courts, and they executed the Ukrainian police who could be rounded up, whom they could find. But these killers in the photograph, and here's one of them in the 80s, they had not been prosecuted for these crimes from this day, from this massacre of October 41. And so the prosecutor in Zhytomyr, the nearest district court near Mariupol, went into this town and started asking around and questioning and identifying these killers. And our Ukrainian Soviet prosecutor in the 80s did not have this photograph, but did such a thorough job reconstructing the crime. It really matches up very closely to the photograph. And the 3 Ukrainians in the image, because you saw 2, but there's a third one, were convicted. They were executed, 2 of them by firing squad, in January 1987. And the third killer was only 17 years old. He was a youth at the time of committing the crime. So he was given a 15-year sentence, and sent into Inner Russia, into the prison system. And when Ukraine achieved its independence in August 1991, he could have been let out of jail. We don't know. That case could have been reviewed. There's no further information about his whereabouts. He could not be found in 1991. I could not find him. And when I went to Ukraine, I could not find anyone who would tell me about him and about his whereabouts or about his family.
I'm going to go back to the family in this photo and the families who were targeted by the Nazis. There's a question here asking if most families were shot together during this first wave described in the summer of 1941. Also wondering if the family watched other families being shot in the ravine, and what occurred in the hours before this family was shot.
So in the the moment when the Germans, when Himmler and Hitler and the leadership and Heydrich decided to pursue mass murder. So in the very first few weeks of the campaign, just in the first few weeks, the priority was to kill the men, the able-bodied, the Jewish men in state and party offices, which was about resistance and literally kind of decapitating the communities in that way, to go after the men and to remove the head of household and to weaken the community in that way. But within weeks, Himmler authorized the expansion to women and children. It was a kind of transition period, but again, happening very quickly. And he issued a famous order in July to drive Jewish women into the swamps, the Pripyat marshes. And so this kind of total destruction of communities started. And in the Nazi documentation, we see how this rolls out across what Timothy Snyder calls the bloodlands. So from the Baltics down to the Black Sea. So it's simultaneous, it's not just one incident, but it's happening across the Soviet Union. And the reports are coming back from the field, and they're kind of, trying to perfect even how they do these mass shootings, because they're finding them to be kind of difficult to carry out, and logistically and manpower and all of these kind of in a kind of military style type of reporting and implementation of it. So initially the men, and men also called into forced labor assignments, but already in early August, the targeting of women and children in Ukraine, and then by the end of August, entire communities like in Kamenets-Podolsk, and then in Berdichev, and early in September, and then of course Babi Yar is kind of that very important example of not only families, but entire city, urban community, more than 30,000 in 2 days. So there's that escalation is really rapid. Leaving these communities like in Mirapol, really the onslaught was so sudden and trapped, and the desperation and these kinds of choices that had to be made, and could we find hiding places, and could we arrange them with Ukrainians, and parents discussing without the children around, like which of our children will get that hiding place, and how can we arrange it, and can that person be trusted, and hiding certain, in the case of Mirapol, the one survivor testimony, Ludmila Blechman, and talking about her siblings and her daughter, her older sister, who was a beautiful woman, and they didn't register her with the Germans. They wanted her to be unregistered so that she would be undetected, so as a scholar, I can't find her because the family decided not to register her because they wanted to hide her in the attic, in the basement, said never, don't come out, because they were afraid of the Ukrainians and of the sexual violence. So the night before the actual massacre on October 13th, 1941, the Jews of Mirapol were forced out of their homes. This was the pogrom that kind of precedes the systematic mass shooting. So this is the pogrom history that is kind of familiar to people in Mirapol. And so the peasants come in. It's, there's a kind of knowledge historically as far as what happens next. The Jews are pulled out of their houses. Their houses are torn apart for wood, their furniture, the pillows, the bedding. They're brought into the center of town. There's sexual violence. There's other forms of physical violence and torture. And humiliation as they're marched into the center of town, and forced to stay, in this case, overnight, exhausted into the night, and under guard, and continuing to be humiliated and in fear. The community can hear them in this gathering place in the center of town. I can show you, this is the center of town, what's left of it in 2014 when I visited. This used to be a very thriving kind of marketplace with a lot of structures here, motels and cafes. And this is really the result of a kind of a gutted civilization of the borderlands of the Pale of Settlement, of what was a Polish kind of manorial system in this town. It's another history, but yeah, they were forced here. And then the next day is kind of closer to the German, genocidal kind of finishing off. So if you have the history of pogroms and all of that, you may know of, that occurred, and then the uniformed policemen come in, the customs guards, the distribution of the bullets, the forcing them to be marched to this scene. They're detained in a prison while and was placed into these groups and then brought to the massacre. They can see, they can hear, they can smell what's happening to their other members of the Jewish community. And so, that day from about daybreak, if you read the book, I follow it, almost to the hour based on all this testimony, until about, the afternoon. They take a lunch break, and these mass, the sound of the bullets, and then the guards stay into the night to make sure that nobody escapes from the pit, which has then been covered up with kind of loosely with the dirt, and the ravine kind of closed is part of that as well, the cover up. And then this one survivor, Ludmila Blackman, who during the night, she describes crawling across the field in the moonlight and with her bloody shirt and climbing out of the pit, and she's the sole survivor.
There's a question from someone who had read a previous book that you wrote that I forgot to mention, Nazi Empire Building in Ukraine. And they're asking about the auction of goods belonging to the murdered Jewish people.
Yeah. This is something that did happen rather more frequently than scholars had realized. The work of Father Patrick Dubois and Yehad Unum, this group has been going into mostly Ukraine, but also other parts of the former Soviet Union, the Baltics and Belarus and Poland, identifying hundreds of mass graves that had not been marked before and collecting thousands of witness testimonies. And I brought them and asked them if they would come to Mariupol with me and do their work. And I got to observe that and learn from them and collect more testimony and evidence. And in fact, we went to the mass grave together. I had the map here. I had this map from the Soviet investigation. Here's the center of town. Here's the arrow showing the way they were marched. The Soviet investigators forced those Ukrainian killers to reenact what happened, and there are photographs of that in the files. And here the arrows go here. They're walked. Here's the Mariupol Park, and here's the actual site here. And you can see the trees. There was a fortress up here historically. This is along the Sluch River, so it's just outside of town, maybe 5-10 minute walk. And so this group, Yehad and Unum, we went to the scene and we walked to the site. We interviewed the witnesses who were nearby, who described what was happening and what we see in the photograph. And here's another one who's talking about what she saw in the marketplace. She had been given a home. Her father was a forester, and as part of his kind of compensation, they were given a Jewish home. And so she had a very interesting story about what she saw and a Jewish woman who tried to hide in their home. And we retraced those steps. And here we are walking and going into that site with this photographer, with another scholar, with an interpreter. And we discovered the actual mass grave, or kind of what was left of it here. Immediately detected that the terrain was very unusual, that the digging of the mass grave, the decomposition of the victims. There's a chapter in the book about the environmental history, as I mentioned at the beginning, and what that means for these places, and the foliage and the moonscape, the haloing effect of the land. And today, with aerial photography, we can identify places of mass graves and so forth, whether it's Syria or Rwanda. And this is similar to, you can see the change of in the terrain. And we actually found bones of these victims. That's part of a vertebrae. And that was all findable, discoverable, because when the Soviets carried out their investigation, they had to find the victims and the remains of the victims, and they did this in a very aggressive way. It was another assault on those victims, on their souls, their resting place here. As horrible as their deaths were, this was still their final resting place. And they used tractors and a lot of heavy equipment, and that's why those bones are up on the surface. This was 2016 when we discovered them.
What is there any
But the
commemoration or
material, I just wanted to mention though that the material objects that remained from those Jews, whether it was their homes, their furniture, and their bedding and sewing machines, I mean, whatever was left was, even those shoes that are in the photograph, right, are part of the compensation, part of a way to pay off the local population, and that, you know, so they're kind of, they're still there in the community, these objects. And one witness we talked to, a Ukrainian, spoke about going into one of the former Jewish shops during the pogrom and finding toothpaste and finding other things that she was excited about, and running off with those. And, you know, so it's, I don't say that in a way to be kind of dismissive or judgmental. I'm, you know, the material needs of Ukrainians coming out of the Stalinization and the terror and the Holodomor and the poverty of that, of the peasantry. You know, there's a lot of reasons why Ukrainians like participated, witnessed, and were kind of complicit in that way, and confiscating what was left in the material way of the Jewish community. There was not, as far as I can tell, there was no kind of formal auction that was held in the center of town, but that is something that the Yahad and Unum team, they've been able to document that in other places.
Well, this takes us to the final question, which is asking about the memorialization which takes place there today, or is there any sort of memorial at the site?
When the Soviet prosecutor came in and carried out that trial, there was, once they found those remains, what do they do with those remains? Like the bone that I just showed you in that image. And they did try to piece them together. The skeletal remains, and carefully kind of laid them out, and even identified a man who was a former head of the Jewish community, because he was disabled, and they could see from his bone formation descriptions of him as being disabled, and so they could identify that person in that way, which was quite something. But they took those remains and they brought them to a very beautiful spot along the Sluch River, up on a hillside, and they erected a monument. It's not, as was typical in the Soviet Union, it's not very specific about, you know, the Holocaust or the Jewish victims, but some descendants of Jews from Mirapol, the Rappaport family, the Bleckmans I mentioned, who came back for the trial, participated in that memorial service, that reburial of those remains. And when you go to Mirapol today, you'll find that memorial, but that's not the site of the massacres. That site I showed you in that other photograph.
Okay. Unfortunately, we are out of time. But I want to thank you so much for the work that you have done. On a personal note, as someone who works in this field, and I know our audience is composed of survivors, 2Gs, 3Gs, volunteers for the museum, and people who regularly engage in our programs as well. And I know for me, just speaking for myself, there has to be a wall of some sort that's constructed as we work with this material. And every once in a while, something comes along and makes cracks at that wall. And in the case of this book, it just completely destroys it. So I want to thank you for this incredible work and really touching a part of myself that I often keep protected. There was something just so intimate about this book, the way it was written, and the topic that was covered. So thank you for writing this book. And as we commemorate the invasion of the Soviet Union, I want to thank you also for honoring the family in this photo, and for those who are not shown in the photo as well. So those in Mariupol, in Ukraine, and in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union. So thank you so much for the work that you do. I want to, as we wrap up, I would like to ask everyone to please fill out our survey that you'll find in the chat. You will also find a link as well to our museum shop where you can purchase a copy of the Ravine. And you'll also see some of our upcoming public programs, which we hope to see you attend. So thank you all for watching the program tonight, and have a good evening.
Thank you.